And I think that we're in really treacherous waters right now. The Fed is going to have to react a little bit earlier than they probably want to. And I hope that they realize that it's time to cut rates, even when inflation's not all the way down.
We're talking about the issue of our standard of living and what's next for the American economy with our next guest, Betsey Stevenson. She is a professor of economics and public policy at the University of Michigan. She was previously a member of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Obama, and she was the chief economist for the U.S. Department of Labor in 2010 to 2011. She's also a frequent contributor to mainstream media, including Bloomberg. Welcome to the show, Betsey. Thank you for being here.
Oh, it's great to talk to you today.
What are some of the things that you think Americans care most about right now when it comes to the economy?
I think the thing Americans care most about is inflation. I think what's hard for both candidates is that actually, what the administration does, what a president does not have a ton of control over inflation. So a lot of what they say is really about building like trust and confidence in people, because at the end of the day, really, it's the Federal Reserve that controls our rate of inflation. But I do think that's the number one thing on their minds, and they're going to be interested in and what the candidates say. Again, I think the challenge is that the typical person, for good reason, does not have a solid understanding of what might increase or decrease inflation. So it's not like they're going to be laying out plans and you're going to say, aha, that guy knows how to get prices down or to stop the rate of inflation. In fact, I'll start, just one clear misnomer is I think people want to see prices come down. And prices are very unlikely to come down on average. In fact, most economists would tell you deflation would cause a lot more harm than it's worth, because deflation requires people's incomes coming down as well, and a lot of people losing their jobs.
Does the Phillips curve work in real life, the inverse relationship between the unemployment rate and inflation? I bring this up because the unemployment rate has been trickling up. It's now 4%.
That's a really, really tricky question. So a lot of people have said there's no way to bring inflation down without bringing the unemployment rate up. And they've been saying that for years. Ever since we started this battle, we saw inflation hit 9%, and people were howling. The Federal Reserve needs to jack rates. We need to really just push down on the brake very hard, cause unemployment to zoom up to maybe 6-7%, and that'll bring inflation down. And yet we were able to see inflation come all the way down to 3%, right? So most of the way down without really much of an increase in the unemployment rate at all. Why is that? Well, that relationship between unemployment and inflation is not really an exploitable relationship. It more describes what tends to happen on average. So inflation happens when people want more stuff, they want more goods and services than the economy can provide. And as a result, what do people do? Well, if 10 people want to buy apples and there are only 5 apples to buy, you're going to bid up the price of apples until the 5 highest payers get the apples. That's how we get higher prices when there are these shortages, when people want to buy more than it's being produced. But the other thing that could happen is they could grow more apples. And so the question is, how quickly can supply respond? And in the labor market, what we saw was the labor market expanded much more than people thought. So we didn't need to see businesses shrink. Businesses were able to continue to grow even when we were, seeing this high inflation. Businesses were able to continue to grow, and they were able to find people to hire without, basically having to steal workers from other businesses. We were able to see supply expand. How did supply expand? 2 things happened. Native workers were willing to come into the labor force at higher rates than anybody anticipated. We've got the highest rate of female labor force participation in history right now. And we also saw immigrants return to the US. We saw a lot of immigrants leave the United States during COVID. They went home, they went where they thought it was going to be safe, and they've been returning. And while that's causing a lot of political consternation, the reality is that has put the flexibility in the labor force that meant that we didn't need to see unemployment really rise in order to bring inflation down. Now, the last thing I'll say is you said unemployment is up a good half point right now.
Mm-hmm.
Is that as high as it needs to go? Will it keep going up? I think that's the big question that should be on everyone's minds. But I think they're still worried more about inflation than they are about that 4% unemployment rate.
I'm going to come back to that question because we are going to talk about the labor market. Back to inflation, though, Professor Stevenson, you said in an interview with Bloomberg recently that the best way we can fight inflation right now would be to expand the housing supply. Can we expand on this comment? Who's we right now? Are you talking about the private sector or the government?
People talk about the economy all the time as if it's like some third party over there, like, hey, it's
Sure,
me,
yeah.
you, and the economy, and we're all at a cocktail party together. Actually, we are the economy. So when I say we, I mean the economy, the society. We as a collective need to increase housing supply. Why do I think that's important? Because one of the lingering things that's pushing up inflation is rising housing prices. And that one's really hard for the Fed to tackle because the Fed's raising interest rates because the whole goal of raising interest rates is to get people to buy less stuff, which will bring down prices because there'll be lower demand. But it does have a knock-on effect of raising the cost of housing because all of a sudden people's mortgage rates are higher. People who are in long-term low interest rate mortgages don't want to put their house on the market. You might be right now 65 years old in a 4-bedroom family home, and you're thinking, I should downsize. And then you look at what would happen if you cashed in your 30-year mortgage, which is locked in at 3%, to buy a much smaller condo and get a mortgage at 6 or 7%. And you're like, wait a minute, I'm going to get less and pay more? No, I think I'll stay in my big house. So that has meant that we've seen, less inventory come onto the market than we otherwise would. So what do we need to do? I think everybody can participate in trying to expand housing supply. Government should reduce regulations that limit the density of housing. Government should make it easier for housing and renovations to go through quickly. All of us should curb our NIMBY instincts. I think every person is like, yeah, I believe in expanding housing until you're talking about my neighborhood. What, you want an ADU in my neighbor's backyard? I don't want that, right? So we've all got to curb our NIMBY instincts and say the only way that housing prices can come down is if housing density goes up. And that's going to mean I got to have more people living around me. I think that's really hard for people to accept. So when I say we have to think about expanding housing supply, I really do mean all of us. All of us should do our part, whether we're a policymaker, whether we're just a person who's going out to the polls and trying to slow the expansion of housing supply. We all need to realize that there's only one answer to bringing down housing costs, and that is increasing the supply available to people.
What about for renters? How should we make it affordable for renters?
It's the same answer. That doesn't.
Should we have rent control?
Absolutely not. Rent control goes the opposite direction. So you can put in rent control policies, and then what do? You reduce the returns to building new housing. So you reduce the returns, so then we're going to develop less housing. Does the person who would benefit most from the rent control get access to the housing? Not necessarily, right? So you put rent control in place and you're going to have less housing available. The people who get it are the lucky winners of the lottery. They get cheaper housing. But what about the people who don't get it? And when you have cheaper housing, you have more people competing for it, perhaps for the wrong reasons. Perhaps you have somebody who was, who would have, choose to live somewhere else, maybe in a lower cost area that now wants to move into this area because you have rent control. So you just defeated your purpose because you increased the demand in your market and you put in forces that would reduce your supply. So the answer to cheaper rent is increased density, is increased supply. You could subsidize the building. That if you subsidize building of rental housing, that would bring down housing prices. But I fundamentally believe in every market I've ever seen it tried in that rent control ultimately reduces the quality and the access to housing for renters.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Professor, but wouldn't lower housing prices or more affordable housing actually incentivize consumers to spend more? I mean, presumably you have more money from paying lower rent, or you have more money from paying a lower mortgage, and now you have more discretionary spending power. Isn't that going to boost inflation, not bring down inflation?
So I just want to make sure we're switching topics away from
Okay.
like rent control, right?
No,
And
yeah,
you're
we're
just
going
saying
back to inflation. The
you're
overall,
just saying, okay, we expand housing supply and housing inflation goes to zero. Phew, we
yeah,
tackled that problem.
yes,
Are people just going to take their excess money and spend it on something else? And
yes,
so now we're going to have banana price inflation, or
right,
we're going to
right.
have, uh, you know, uh, vacation inflation. So, first of all, I think that everybody has to live somewhere, and that's one of the real problems with housing inflation. And realize when we look at inflation metrics, I think that one of the reasons housing inflation is so bizarre is, the CPI counts me as paying more for my housing today than I was paying 5 years ago. I'm living in the same house. I'm in the same locked in low rate mortgage, but my house is worth so much more. I could rent it out for more, which means the implicit rent I'm paying has gone up. So there's a whole bunch of people where this is a measure, it kind of a measurement issue, but in some sense, not a measurement issue, a real phenomenon. Like your house is worth more. Should you rent it out and do something else? But so that aspect will bring down inflation if we just slow the growth of housing prices. Now, when you talk about renters, if renters are paying less or new homeowners are paying less in terms of what they're buying and their mortgage payments, what will they do with that money? They won't spend it dollar for dollar. Typically, what we would see is some of that will end up, going into savings. Some of it will go into other forms of spending, but those other forms of spending may have more elastic supply. So that doesn't necessarily, we're not
Yeah,
looking at a fixed bundle of goods in the US.
right.
The question is, you can always curb inflation by having supply expand to meet demand. And
Well,
so that is I mean, and then, when you think about Federal Reserve policy, all
yes.
the Fed can do is reduce demand. And that's what monetary policy is all about. We can reduce demand. So if
Hmm.
demand is exceeding supply, what the Fed wants to do is bring demand down to supply. But remember, it is also possible to grow supply. And ultimately, growing supply instead of cutting demand is going to allow us all to live a better life.
So, what is your outlook then for inflation? Currently, the headline CPI, according to the BLS, is 3.3%, 3.4 rather, 3.4% is April's number. It has come down from 9%, still nowhere near the Fed's 2% target. So the question becomes, are we heading towards the Fed's 2% target, or can we see perhaps a resurgence back towards 9%?
I think we don't see a resurgence. I think there's nothing that indicates we're going to see a resurgence. The I think there is a question of whether it gets stuck at 3%. And I think we'll have to answer the question of how much are we willing to give up to get it from 3% to 2%. Um, you know, long before we had the post-pandemic inflation, which happened around the globe, um, long before that, around the globe, many monetary policymakers and macroeconomists discussed is 2% the right target? Would we be better off with a 3% target? We need a little bit of inflation to make the economy move more smoothly and to stay out of recessions. And if you're in a world where the economy is reliably and regularly increasing prices at 3% a year, it's all good. It's sort of when we are at 2%, think about what happens. Like our incomes grow by 2%, the prices grow by 2%, and we're all able to buy, in terms of inflation, we expect it, we plan for it, it's low enough that we don't spend a lot of our energy thinking about it. Is 3% not much worse than 2%? That's the debate. We don't have to have that here. But what everyone has said since inflation took off in 2021 is you can't change the rules of the game when you're in the middle of the game. And what we're in the middle of is bringing inflation back down to the target. So I can't come out here and say to you, you know what, maybe we should have a 3% target, because that would lose central banks their credibility. That said, I think it's important to realize that 3% inflation is just nowhere near as bad as 4%, 5%, 6%, 7%, 8% inflation. In fact, in an alternative world, we might say it's better than 2%. So I do think at some point we'll have to discuss how much are we willing to give up to get inflation down to 2%. I think the Fed's going to hold rates high. And I think the economy is currently slowing. I think that slowing will bring inflation down. The question is by how much and how long and how painful, and will slowing ultimately mean a recession? You don't just have to look in the US, look at a country like Australia, similar problem with inflation running roughly right around the same. And they're in what I would call a per capita recession. A per capita recession is when your economic growth, it's above zero. It's not above the population growth rate. And so from a per capita perspective, living standards are falling. How hard should the Reserve Bank of Australia go at the existing inflation when they've got an economy that is teetering on the brink of recession? The US is going to have to answer the same question. Personally, I think recessions are really painful. Unemployment scars people for life. And I think that we're in really treacherous waters right now. And the Fed is going to have to react a little bit earlier than they probably want to. And I hope that they realize that it's time to cut rates, even when inflation's not all the way down.
Okay, so you were chief economist of the Department of Labor. So let's talk about the labor market now. Let's talk about jobs. Let's talk about our standard of living. First of all, how would you evaluate the strength of the labor market today? Is it consistent with the view that we are not getting a hard landing?
Well, I think it's absolutely consistent with the view we're not getting a hard landing. And some people say like, oh, we could still get one. We could still have a recession. But to bring inflation from 9% to 3%, with unemployment staying below 4%, that's the definition of a soft landing. Look, what people might not realize is if you go back to, any previous period, people said that you can't have unemployment stay consistently below about 5.5%. And that's what I learned in graduate school in the 90s. When I was serving in the Obama White House, the view, particularly among our career macro folks, was, don't be, a hackish policy person. We can't really get unemployment below 5.5%. It's just not consistent with stable prices. And what we saw was between 2015 and 2019, and I should say the labor market improvements really began strongly in 2015, and continued all the way through 2019. So I don't think the president of either party actually has a lot to do with this. But what we saw was unemployment really coming down, continuing to come down, and stably staying low. That we had unemployment come as low as it did, 3.5%, was almost unheard of. And it's why old school economists who've been around for a long time thought, oh my God, we really have to get unemployment up like a full 2 or 3 percentage points. And that's because they just couldn't imagine a world where the labor market could be so strong. Why was it so strong? What we saw coming out of the pandemic was a surge in new business formation that was bigger than anything we'd seen in many decades. And then new businesses need to hire. And we saw a lot of people changing jobs. We saw the number of job opportunities in 2021, 2022, 2023 were millions and millions and millions more job openings than we had seen in any previous era. Job openings are still above pre-pandemic levels. So that meant there's a lot of churning, super dynamic labor market. And what we saw was in a really dynamic labor market, there's lots of jobs for people to take. And that created like a lot of momentum that allowed, I think, supply to expand to meet demand, bringing prices down and getting people into jobs where they were bringing a lot of value. And that extra value meant that we've even seen real wages rise despite inflation running at 9%. People are earning more today in inflation adjusted terms than they were in 2019. That to me is the definition of a soft landing.
Okay, this is I'm going to come back to wages just a minute, but this is a stat from last month. So non-farm payrolls advanced 272,000. Job growth surged per May data. However, in the same month, the unemployment rate ticked up from 3.9 to 4%. How do you explain this?
So I'm going to explain it in a super wonky way.
Okay.
Which is that, look, we have two ways in which we take the pulse of the labor market every month. One is that we survey businesses and we ask businesses about how many people they have on payroll. And one of the tricky things about that is that if there are businesses that are shutting down, they don't respond. And if there are businesses that are super busy, they don't respond. And so we have to take guesses at why people aren't responding and make estimates. And it's really hard to know what's the rate of new business formation. So we have to guess how many new businesses are forming. And often those guesses are a little backward looking. So that's the data we get from businesses. The good news is we survey lots and lots of businesses, which gives us a snapshot into millions of workers every month. That's where the number that reports the number of jobs added comes from. It comes from that business survey. And look, it can be off by 100,000 workers, plus or minus. I remember serving as chief economist of the Department of Labor, and we had a particularly painful August where the number came out and it was exactly zero. No jobs added, no jobs lost. Well, a year later, we learned actually we had added 200,000 or more than 200,000 jobs that month. So there's a lot of space for revision there. We also survey households. Now, we're surveying not very many households, so there's a ton of error in that data. That's where we get our unemployment rate. But now, instead of surveying businesses and saying, how many people are you paying, we're surveying households and saying, what'd you do last month? Now, in lots of months, these two surveys tell us different things. They paint very different pictures. And what's useful to me as an economist trying to understand the macroeconomy is I look at both of them and I put some weight on both of them. I tend to put a little bit less weight on the household survey because it's noisier because we survey so few households compared to businesses. But if you look at last month, what we saw was the households told us there were roughly 400,000 fewer people with jobs. Now, as you pointed out, the business survey, the headline number was that we added 272,000 jobs. So what's right? Did we add 272,000 jobs or did we lose 400? The reality is put a little bit of weight on both. So we probably added something closer to about 180,000 jobs, closer to expectations. And unemployment probably my guess is it ticks down a little bit in the next iteration, but at the same time, I do think the labor market is slowing, and most of the job growth is now coming in the areas where job growth was coming prior to the pandemic, which is education and health services and leisure and hospitality.
This is another interesting stat. In May, there were 8.32 million people working multiple jobs in the US. Multiple job holders now account for 5.2% of civilian employment. I think, according to the BLS, this is probably one of the highest numbers or concentrations of people holding multiple jobs. Is this a sign of strength or weakness, Professor?
So first of all, let me just say the BLS is absolutely the worst measure of people holding multiple jobs, and it is very frustrating.
Okay, please enlighten us as to why.
People they just don't tell the truth in the survey. They're like, no, I don't have if you see a primary job as so primary that you forget, oh yeah, I took on this consulting thing on the side, but that didn't count, or I had this side hustle, but that didn't count.
Right.
So they often fail to report multiple jobs. And then we look at the IRS data and we're like, okay, there's a lot more people who are getting multiple 1099s or 1099s plus W-2s, much more than what we see in the BLS survey. So we know that secondary job holding, gig jobs, side hustles has been growing over time, but it has not been growing anywhere near as much in the BLS data as it has in the tax data, which is a little bit more accurate because people get issued tax forms. I've been looking at surveys just asking people directly, do you have a side hustle?
Mm.
And then now all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, yeah, I make friendship bracelets for Taylor Swift concerts that I sell on Etsy. And we see more than half of young people have side hustles. And then even older people are increasingly having side hustles. Some of those side hustles, people say, I would never turn them into my main job. Other people say, if this takes off, I would love for it to be my main job. A lot of people test out career moves now as side hustles. I personally think multiple job holding is, when we see it growing, it's a good thing because it is an indication of people having a lot of opportunities out there. Now, you might say, no, multiple job holding is what people do when they can't make ends meet.
Yeah.
Actually, if you look at the data on asking people, do you have a side hustle? People with higher incomes are more likely to say they have a side hustle than people with lower incomes.
You mean higher income from their primary job, not as a result of multiple side hustles? Is that what you meant?
Well, actually, you ask people, what is your total income?
Okay.
And so you might say, well, that's obvious. But I mean, the highest number of people with side hustles are people who report making six figures or more.
Okay.
So this is not, whether it comes, maybe you get to six figures because of your side hustle, but that's not a poverty issue. That's an opportunities issue. And not the idea that it's a bunch of people that are barely able to cobble together, and we're not talking household income, I'm talking individual income. So, the idea that it's a bunch of people that can't get their household income above 80,000, so they're working a side hustle, I think is just not right. I think the way to think about side hustles is it's easier to do those today. We have seen the growth in gig work. And when I say the word gig work, you might automatically think about something like rideshare or food delivery. But a lot of what the research has shown is those secondary jobs, that gig work is bigger in white collar work. So business and professional services are really growing, and so are people's side hustles in business and professional services. People wanting to take on that little bit of consulting that maybe I'm going to, do a little bit of where my skill set is on the side. So it's not, I don't think we should, I do not believe that it is a sign of low wages. I believe it is a sign of a lot of opportunities. And I think one of the reasons why it explains why unemployment is so low is that people have a lot of opportunities when they're to stay employed and to make transitions that are more seamless because they say try something out as a side hustle, it works for them, and they drop it. They drop what was once their primary job.
There's roughly 6 million corporations in the US, give or take 500 corporations, the S&P 500. These account for actually the minority of workers, but the majority of the stock market, as you know. During your time at the US Department of Labor, and perhaps even now, which sectors of the economy do you think have contributed to the most in terms of wage growth?
It depends on the time period you're asking about. First of all, inequality had been rising for many, many decades, and it was inequality both in every dimension you could think of, inequality between college graduates and non-graduates, but even inequality within college graduates, inequality within firms. One of the things that has happened is that corporations have chosen to outsource often low-wage labor, and so the gap between what their white collar workers and the janitors that clean up the office make has grown, partially because they've outsourced it to a janitorial service. And so there's a little bit less pressure to make sure that, as you're highly compensating the office workers, that you're doing something that's reasonably fair to the janitorial staff. To the extent that the workers you're outsourcing with are working side by side with your workers, some companies have felt pressure to put standards on, their on the people that they're contracting with to pay their workers more because of the kinds of tensions that get created when you work side by side with someone and there's a deep feeling of inequality. So, for example, I remember more than a decade ago, Microsoft came out and said, if you're going to contract with us, you're going to have to give your workers very similar sick leave and maternity leave and paternity leave, because it's just too weird and it's upsetting our workers and it's upsetting our balance to have, a pregnant Microsoft worker who's expecting paid maternity leave working next to and with a pregnant contractor who's like, I get nothing. So, we've had this rise in inequality. I do think the big corporations often feel more pressure to compensate well, but that's also because they are disproportionately hiring the highest skilled workers, and the highest skilled workers is where compensation has grown the most. So, it's a chicken and the egg kind of situation. The job growth has disproportionately occurred in education and health services, and that's not been a place that's necessarily known for its highest wages. So where job growth is occurring, I mean, that's a job. So in some sense, of course, they're contributing to wage growth, and they're contributing to wage growth by competing with all the other sectors for workers. But you wouldn't look at it and say, boy, that's where the highest wages have come from. But at the same time, if you hadn't had that demand for workers, where would wages be? So I think trying to explain who's had the biggest impact on raising wages, I think, is a little bit of a hard question. I will say that I think that business and professional services growth and its ability to export business and professional services has done a lot to boost the wages of Americans who work in that sector.
Two questions on the long-term trend of the labor market. This one has to do demographics here. This is a study from McKinsey. Now, they said, and I'll just read this paragraph here, labor markets in advanced economies today are among the tightest in 2 decades, not merely a pandemic-induced split, but rather a long-term trend that may continue as workforces age. It goes on to say tightness means foregone economic output. We estimate that GDP in 2023 could have been 0.5% to 1.5% higher across these economies if employers were able to fill their excess job vacancies. First of all, do you agree with the assessment that an aging, I guess, labor force means a tighter labor market?
Yeah, I guess I agree with that. I mean, I think the point here is exactly the point we were bringing up earlier. Why are we able to bring inflation down from 9% to 3% without raising unemployment? Because we had growth in the labor market. We had more people willing to work. Where did those people come from? There are only two places you can grow your labor market immediately, and that's adults in the labor market can choose to work at higher rates, or you can bring in immigrants. Of course, you can, increase your fertility rate, but that's 25 years out, right?
Yeah,
Before they
sure.
turn into the labor market. So those are your two options. In the US, traditionally, men have not been very responsive, even when the labor market's been tight. It's been great. It's hard to pull men back into the labor market. Women have been very responsive. This go round, between 2015 and 2019, we saw both men and women increase their labor force participation. And it was really the first time in 5 decades we'd seen as much growth in male labor force participation, but it was still outpaced by growth in female labor force participation, at least 2 to 1, maybe even more than that. In this recovering from the pandemic, women have also come back stronger than men. We've seen both men and women come back. What we saw in the pandemic was a surge in retirement and a real drop in the labor force participation rate of people over the age of 55. It actually comes back to your question about, is multiple job holding good or bad? Is working when you're older good or bad? And there's a huge literature on this. And it showed that the people who are most likely to work at older ages were actually higher income people. They had cushier jobs and they liked their jobs, and their jobs are part of their identity. So what happened was they could all afford to retire when the pandemic happened. And many, many did, right? I got a letter from my doctor saying, so sorry, my family is urging me to step down because I shouldn't be in a hospital with COVID. And I'm in my late 60s. So we saw this huge retirement surge from the pandemic. I don't think you'll see that from Generation X, right? The people who are in their sort of early 50s now, I think they'll keep working. So I don't know if the McKinsey estimates are right, but I do think the general idea is that the Western world, I'm in Australia right this second, so maybe we just want to call it the advanced economies. The advanced economies have an aging population, and they need young people to work. And the developing economies have a surge of young people. And so we need to bring our needs together. But I think there's a political clash there, because at the time we need immigration the most is when our older population is the most afraid of immigrants changing.
Well, is there literature on whether or not skilled immigration or unskilled immigration contribute more or less to economic growth?
Both of them play a role.
Yeah.
Because, if you bring in, let me give you one small example. In labor markets with more less educated immigrant women from lower income countries, you see higher labor force participation rates among highly skilled native born and first generation women, because they use childcare, and childcare is more available and is more affordable when you have immigrants who are willing to take low paying jobs. So you can see how there's a complementarity that I can't say, if we get the high skilled immigrants, they're going to help us, boost growth because they're going to, really help us do more with less. They may come in as low skilled and help higher skilled native born people be more productive. So we all work together. And what we need to think about is what kind of work is missing in our labor market. Where should we be opening the borders more? And how should we be thinking about the best way to use immigrant labor? I'll give you an example from Australia. which is Australia has a program where young people, and by young, I mean under the age of 30, can come on a working tourist visa. And they take a lot of the hospitality jobs and the agriculture jobs, and you get a longer visa if you're willing to go into a rural area. That work is really important, and it'll frees up, permanent residents in Australia and citizens in Australia to take other jobs. So when it went away, because it did go away during COVID, there was real struggles. So we just, I think, need to be more creative about looking at, reports like the McKinsey report and saying what immigrants are most sorely needed in the US, and how do we make sure that immigrants are not just replacing Americans. Like, I don't want to see, I don't want to see somebody bring in a bunch of coders from another country that are willing to be paid less so we can lay off existing coders in the US, because that's going to displace people. But what we can think about is where can we not hire enough people right now? Who should we be bringing in? And what's the right length of the visa? What should the path of citizenship be? Until we're willing to have, real open conversations about the importance of immigration to our economy, we are going to have the really hodgepodge, poor immigration policies that we have in the United States, that lead us to having more, I think, unhelpful conversations about, like what's going on at the southern border, and I say that's unhelpful in the sense that, it's not even where the majority of people who come in undocumented come from. So, we need to start having fact-based conversations and understand why some people do, have concerns about the number of immigrants coming into their community, and how can we ameliorate those concerns, and where should we be directing immigration to, and how can our whole system make sure that it flows better.
And final part of my discussion with you on the labor market is the subject of automation and AI, which is something that you've been researching, no doubt. I think to narrow down my questioning, the only question I have for you is how disruptive is this? The concern here, and there's many think tanks that agree with the consensus that many, many millions of jobs can be disrupted. And, I'll let you define how disrupted, what disrupted means. But the question is whether or not the labor force participation rate would be structurally and permanently impacted, meaning people would be just dissuaded from entering or re-entering the workforce if they're just replaced by machines.
So there's a lot of uncertainty ahead of us with AI. And so nobody really knows the answers to these questions, and nobody actually really likes living with uncertainty. And I think one of the biggest risks we face is people who are disingenuous, who are willing to promise some kind of certainty or return to the past, might be more listened to than people who are providing more realistic assessment. I think the challenge is not, we can get somewhere great with AI for sure if we're doing the right thing to get there. So how do we manage this transition? One of the most important lessons is we manage transitions better when technology is additive rather than replacing. So, a lot of people were worried that we would come out of the pandemic and a bunch of fast food restaurants and grocery stores would have adopted all sorts of technology to replace workers, like self-checkout kiosks and ordering apps and, delivery by drone. And this would replace all these jobs. And this would mean that we would have a whole bunch of low-wage workers who just become disconnected from the labor force and can never enter it again. That didn't happen. So let's investigate why it didn't. So first of all, a lot of those adoptions of new technology I just talked about did happen. Why didn't they create the kind of, disruptive world? Well, the first thing is they weren't laying anybody off. those people had already left those jobs to be safe from COVID. So that's what I mean by additive. Companies adopted the technology as they were struggling to hire. And because they had technology that allowed workers to be more productive, they were willing to pay more. Because they were willing to pay more, that drew people into the labor force. All of a sudden, we have more low-wage workers or low-skilled, less educated workers working today than we did prior to the pandemic, and they're working at much higher real wages than they were prior to the pandemic. That's the success story. You can have technology that takes some of the tasks of humans, but at the same time makes the work humans do more valuable, actually increase employment. So the lesson from that is that we have to figure out how we adopt technology as a society in an orderly way, in a way that doesn't mean, we're going, if you're a law firm and you just hand out pink slips to all your junior associates and paralegals because your AI can now do all that work, what are those people going to do? If instead, you start teaching the people that you currently have to use that technology, and you become more efficient as a firm, and you're able to grow as a firm, and you're able to take on more cases, then you don't have to let anybody go. Now you might say, well, wait a minute, but the counterfactual is there's a bunch of people you would have hired without the AI that you're not hiring. But because you're not displacing, we're talking human beings. Human beings do not do well when they're displaced. They keep trying to do the thing they were doing before. They don't adapt as well. When people see there's not as many jobs as paralegals, and they might think, oh, maybe I should get a job doing this other thing, right? And so what we need is to make sure that there's a lot of training out there, and that there's a lot of incentives for employers to work with the workers they currently have, and that people have a safety net they can fall on and spring back from if they do lose their jobs. Because that's the other thing we saw coming out of the pandemic. People were given trillions of dollars by the government in terms of unemployment insurance, in terms of pandemic relief, in terms of student loan relief. And they used all this money not to kick back and never work again, but to find a better space for themselves in the labor force. And I think it's really taught us that a safety net helps keep people engaged in society in a way that with no safety net, people can fall into despair, into opioid use, into crime, into all sorts of things that are really sticky and hard for them to get out of. So what I expect us to see with AI is tasks in any given job, the tasks are going to start to evolve. The question will be, can the workers evolve along with the task evolution at the same pace? I think there will be some jobs that evolve so much they're almost unrecognizable in 5 or 6 years, even if they have the same title. And I think that there will be fewer entry points for young people. And it's one of the reasons why the fact that I would call this younger generation, maybe Gen Z, the hustle generation.
Yeah.
And as long as they keep their hustle up, I think they'll find their space, but I do think it's going to be much more challenging for them than it was for previous generations to figure out where they're going to put their foot in the door.
Do you think the Department of Labor should perhaps coordinate with the Department of Education, if not already, to devise a program that could educate the future generations in a world of AI and automation?
I always think that the Department of Education and the Department of Labor should be in constant communication. So that would be a great idea. I do think that our societal views of education are going to have to change, and change quite rapidly, because we do need to think. Under President Bush, for good reason, we decided we were going to be really testing a lot of kids. We want to test them. We want to see where they're at. We want to see whether their teacher, their schools are doing a good job. We want no student left behind. And we're going to check this through constant assessment. The problem is we're giving assessments that AI can pass. And we're so busy teaching to the tests that AI can already pass that we're not teaching them a bunch of other skills that they're going to need. So I think our education's got to completely refocus on what are the things that makes us human? What are the creative skills, the empathy skills, the soft skills? As
Not even
well.
creatives are safe. I mean, look at what Midjourney is doing with the artists, right? I mean, ChatGPT can give anyway. I digress. I'll let you finish.
I agree with you that creators are not safe. At the same time, I think it will always feel better to look. We went through this experiment in COVID. We didn't get to go to live music. We didn't get to go to live plays. We didn't get to see people in person. And it's not the same to all be interacting with people on a box, to see your concerts on a screen. You want to be in a crowd, you want to feel the energy of the people, and you want to be at a play. I recently went to see Death of a Salesman, and whoa, that's such an emotionally powerful story. And it was emotionally powerful because of the way the actors brought it to life on the stage. Different actors would have brought it differently, right? I've read the play, I've seen the movie. And so I don't think machines are going to outhuman us, at least not in the near term. And we do want to think about what it means to think on your feet, to be creative, to be different. Look, I'm a writer. I hear you. I get into ChatGPT and I'm like, oh man, that thing just wrote me as well as I can write myself. And it's really bad for someone like me who's got a lot of writing out in the world, because I can go into ChatGPT and say, could you write like Betsey Stevenson? And then it like writes in my voice. It's very painful. I don't even think my children could tell the difference between ChatGPT writing me and me writing me. But at the same time, I will say every time I turn into my editor something where I've had ChatGPT help me correct it or help me draft it, the parts that he really likes, the parts where he's like, wow, that is an insight nobody's had. Those are the parts that ChatGPT did not have anything to do with. Because the problem with ChatGPT is it's predictable. Why is it predictable? Because it's a prediction machine. And so our job is to continue to think outside the box. And I do think that I think that at a minimum, it's going to mean moving us away from standardized testing. And I do think it means more art, more plays, more spontaneity, more music, more sport, because I think it's about thinking on your feet about how to interact with another human being. And you can do that in a baseball game where you have to decide whether you're going to steal the base. You got to look at that other person and try to decide what they're going to do. Or you can think about it, you're in a play and your classmate flubs their line. How do you react on your feet? I'd like to see our kids building those skills more. And that's going to mean we have to change how we fund schools, how we think about what schools are doing. Yeah. We have to stop cutting funding for arts and sports. And we have to stop spending so much on testing.
Okay. Final topic, and I'll let you go, Professor. This has been a great talk. You and your co-author wrote a paper in 2009 called The Paradox of Declining Female Happiness, which shows that women are generally less happy per your measure, and I'll let you explain that, from the 1970s until 2005, despite having higher incomes, higher levels of education, so on and so forth. First, I'll let you explain, just summarize your findings for us, and ultimately whether or not you think this has any impact on household formation and the fertility rate.
So first of all, what we found is women have gotten less happy relative to men. So people get happier with more income. And so more income has been good for overall happiness. We find people with more income are happier than people with less income, and that's true across people at a point in time. It's true over time. It's true across nations. I think the reason people hear the myth that more income doesn't make you happier is because we know that there's diminishing benefits to those extra dollars. So for every, the more money you have, the more extra money you have to get the same sort of bang for your buck in terms of happiness. You give a person with only $1,000 an extra $100, and they get a lot more happy than if you gave that $100 to somebody who had $1 million in the bank. But that doesn't mean that the person who has $1 million in the bank gets nothing. It's just tiny, tiny, tiny. And I think that's actually really important for thinking about redistribution, because redistribution doesn't cause no pain for the people you take the money from. It just causes bigger gains for the people you give the money to than it causes pain to the ones you take it from. When it comes to thinking about the why has women's happiness declined over the last 50 years relative to men's, the truth is we're not able to definitively answer the question. But a lot of people have proposed, it's going into the workforce. But we see these declines just as much for women who are stay-at-home moms as for women who are working. Maybe it's the decline in marriage, but we see it among married and single people. We see it among people who hold religious views versus people who don't. So it's very hard to explain. There's a couple of plausible explanations that we can neither completely confirm nor deny. One is that it looks like there's a wider a range of domains that are important to women's happiness today than in the past. So in the past, women's happiness was much more tightly correlated to their marital happiness. And things like how satisfied they were with their job, or having a job or not having a job, or with their community was just less important for their overall happiness than their marriage. Today, women look a lot more like men in terms of the fact that their marriage matters, but so does their career or lack of a career. So does their community, how they feel about the community. All these things seem to matter for well-being. And so that might just mean that women's sense of their role in the world has broadened. And with that broadening, we have seen a convergence, because women used to report being a lot happier than men. We've seen a convergence that's meant that they look a lot more like men in terms of their overall happiness. It might even just be a measurement thing, that when you asked women about their happiness or their life satisfaction in the past.
Yeah, how is this measurement made? Is this a survey? Is this just rating one?
Yeah, these are all, it's all survey data. Lots of people are always skeptical about the survey data. Again, at a point in time, the survey data has been, rigorously evaluated by psychologists. And there is a high correlation between how people answer these questions and then physical measures of well-being, like genuine smiles. They'll video record you and see like the muscles in your face. Do you look like a happy or unhappy person? They'll look at eye movement. They'll look at heart rate. So we know that these self-reports are pretty good, but we don't know that they're necessarily stable over time. So it's really asking you, like, on a scale of 1 to 10, how satisfied would you say you are with your life? 10 being very satisfied, 1 being not very satisfied, or on a scale of 1 to 4, how happy would you say you are? It's questions like that. So we might think that this measurement has just changed for women over time. It might be as simple as that. And so maybe nothing really has changed. Another explanation, though, is that as a society, we have become not just more polarized is what's happened more recently, but we just have become more diffuse. We spend more time alone. We live in more square footage on our own. We're more likely to live alone. We are more likely to live in communities we're not involved in. The scholar Bob Putnam has documented this phenomenon called bowling alone. And in this phenomenon of bowling alone, he basically points out, like, we're bowling as much as we used to, but we're less likely to join the bowling league. We're less likely to get out with our group of 12 people to go bowling, and we're more likely to just go either by ourselves or with one other person. And it might be that this reduction in community gathering has hurt women's well-being more than it's hurt men's. It may be that it's hurt both of them, and we see this more in women's self-reports than men's. But I think a lot about this issue of how do we find a way to have more community support, because humans are social creatures, and social creatures really suffer from loneliness. And we've had the US Surgeon General come out and declare an epidemic of loneliness. And I think that, and what we see is women living longer, women being more likely to spend time up in their life alone. And so I think in a lot of ways that 2009 paper was a bit of a hey, pay attention to this issue, and we've seen it get worse over time.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Professor Stevenson. Where can we learn more about you, follow your work?
So I have a podcast, Think Like an Economist. It's really good if you want to understand sort of basics of principles of microeconomics or principles of macroeconomics. The podcast was, came out of my Principles of Economics textbooks, which are available globally with both Canadian and Australian adaptations, as well as their American version, and available in other countries and their languages. So those are places to look for me. And of course, you can always read my Bloomberg column.
Okay, very good. Well, I appreciate your time. You've been very generous with your time. So thank you very much. We'll put the links in the description so people can check that out. We'll speak again soon. Cheers.
Okay, great. It was nice talking with you.
And thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.